same time sexual ecstasy. And this, it seems to me, is Michelangelo's greatest sculptural celebration of male sexuality. This is a much more erotic or homoerotic image than even David. There's something else though too, which I think is focused when you look at this rough area at the bottom, that in fact is an ape hewn out of stone very coarsely. You see its face, and there's a kind of joke going on here. On one level, this is perhaps Beauty and the Beast. On another level, it's the idea of sculpture trying to ape or copy nature. But thirdly, and I think most crucially, it's about process. The figure itself, so wonderfully finished with that kind of polish and sheen that make it look like a real human being, seems to emerge out of this rough stone. And it's the idea of Michelangelo back in Carrara, looking at blocks of marble, and in his imagination, in his creative mind, he sees an image inside the marble, and his job as a sculptor is to free or liberate that image.
Michelangelo was now very famous. His work was increasingly sought after, even tiny sketches, and consequently he was rich and able to support his whole family. Nonetheless, he was loath to refuse commissions and often had several jobs on the go at once. He worked frantically, frequently complaining in letters to friends of not having time to eat or even sleep. One of the most magnificent projects he did manage to complete was here, in the church of San Lorenzo in Florence. The Medici Chapel was commissioned by the new Pope, Leo X, as a tomb to glorify his own family. The result is an incredibly designed monument, showing Michelangelo's ability to fuse grandeur with intimacy. But Michelangelo's relationship with the Medici went sour when they realized he was a Republican at heart. Fearing for his life, he left Florence for good in 1534 and settled in Rome. It was during this time that he wrote letters and poems to the talented young aristocrat Tommaso de Cavalieri, with whom it's thought he may have been in love. He found it hard to reconcile his homosexuality with his love of God and his deep desire for salvation in the next life. And nowhere was he able to express this conflict more clearly than in the final great work of his life. He returned to the scene of his earlier triumph, the Sistine Chapel, this time to paint the Last Judgment on the altar wall. Michelangelo laboured relentlessly on the fresco from 1536 to 1541, surviving a nasty fall from the scaffold and with his eyesight failing. By any reckoning, it's an astonishing achievement, but all the more so for being the work of a man well into his 60s. As he'd done before, Michelangelo uses colour with great subtlety, but the style of the painting is more brutal than the ceiling of the chapel. Its mood is harsher, and its impact is much more disturbing. Christ isn't serenely enthroned at the centre. He's a young, muscular man of action, surrounded by a naked, seething mass of humanity. Many have seen the face of Michelangelo himself in the flayed skin which St. Bartholomew holds up. And whilst there's no direct evidence to support this, the image is strongly in keeping with the artist's growing and recorded terror of the sins of the flesh, as well as his quest for salvation. For the last 20 years of his life, Michelangelo began to concentrate mainly on architectural projects, developing the ideas he'd begun to explore in the church of San Lorenzo in Florence, and exploring the relationship between architecture, sculpture and the human body. The elements that make up the framework of a building, he wrote, are akin to the limbs of a human body, and appropriately enough, for a man so interested in monumental human figures, in 1547 he was made chief architect of the biggest church in Christendom, and for the remaining 2 decades of his life devoted his work to building the dome that still dominates the skyline of Rome. Interestingly enough, he accepted no payment for his work on the mother church. Instead, he saw it as a gift to God and to his church at the end of his life. Although revered for most of his career, in his 70s, Michelangelo began to feel the sharp edge of the critic's tongue. He was accused by some of being a bad colourist. It was hinted that his morality was dubious. His naked saints from the Last Judgment were subjected to censorship. An artist nicknamed the Breeches Maker was instructed to paint over the genitalia of the nude figures with loincloths. Michelangelo grew increasingly pious. Old age had tempered his fascination with the nude figure, and his later works show that he was aiming for something more spiritual than earthly beauty. In the last week of his life, aged 89, he was working on a sculpture of the Virgin Mary mourning her dead son, another Pietà. Shortly after ordering a great number of his drawings to be burned, he died on the 18th of February, 1564. By the end of his life, Michelangelo seemed to have lost faith in his art, yet enjoyed a greater fame than any artist before him. In a way, though, he inspired a new kind of religion, which flourished over the next few centuries, art itself, whose devoted pilgrims still flock to see the work of the painter, sculptor and architect his peers called divine.